Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, in honor of Women's History Month, Stephanie Desmond talks to a legend in public health, retired Hopkins professor Sue Baker, who spent half a century working to better understand why injuries happen and what tools can be used to prevent them. She earned a pilot's license to study aviation safety. Her work on childhood injuries led to the widespread use of car seats. Her work on choking deaths revealed the hot dog as a major culprit. Let's listen for more. Sue Baker, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
In honor of Women's History Month, I wanted to talk to you about your illustrious career in public health, most notably your injury prevention work. So when you started studying at the School of Public Health in 1966, what did injury prevention look like?
It was a big blank. I mean, it wasn't anything that anybody was paying any attention to. No courses. I don't remember it being even mentioned. A few references to accident prevention, which over the years we changed to a focus on the injuries, the personal damage that was occurring, rather than trying to focus on behavior in hopes of changing the way people did things, rather than changing our environments and the things that we had some possibility of changing.
So what drew you to this field, really to help create this field?
I've always been interested in things that kind of fall through the cracks. So the whole field of injury prevention was falling through the cracks. Here was the leading cause of death for half the human span, and we were not talking about it in a school of public health.
So what was the first thing that really got your attention?
In terms of injury problems, I was very much interested to find out what was happening to young children. I knew that motor vehicle crashes were the major cause of death for most of our lives, but I didn't know what was happening to little kids. The data were all sort of bunched together. I could get the number and rates for children less than 5 years of age in all types of motor vehicle crashes, but not how many were killed as occupants or pedestrians or bicyclists or whatever. So I asked the head of the National Center for Health Statistics to give me a tape that I could analyze that would have the motor vehicle crash deaths for all the children under 18 years with data on their age and the circumstances of their crashes. And once I started analyzing it, wow, the discovery that the very youngest children, 6 months of age, had the highest death rates. As I began to think about it, it wasn't too surprising when you thought of all the kids being held in their mothers' laps, young babies whose heads and brains were very vulnerable, were actually acting as airbags. And this was early in the days of airbags, and that's sort of a gruesome way to explain it, but the children were not being protected in any way. In fact, they were being subjected to incredible crash forces. So that's what got me. Realizing that our very youngest children in the under 12 age group had the highest death rates just really smacked me. And I had an opportunity to prevail upon people all over the country who were subsequently instrumental in getting their states to pass legislation that would require kids to be in protective car seats.
So back then, were car seats even in production?
At that time, there were some rather flimsy car seats that were sort of slung over the back of the seat. But once the laws were passed, they very quickly came into production, and public health people and other people got more interested when they learned what a problem it was and that something could really be done about it.
Yeah, that seems to be the key to what you've done in your career is you have learned of issues, investigated them, and helped come up with solutions for how these things can be remedied.
Yeah, that really sort of set the pattern for what I've tried to do.
So I understand that you were involved in anything practically you can imagine when it comes to injury prevention. I know that you were studying airplane safety, you got a pilot's license, you were studying truck fatalities, you drove an 18-wheeler. What was it that made you want to approach the field in this way?
Well, it was an exciting, dynamic field with things happening. And I once went down to the legislature with my husband, Tim Baker, and listened to him testifying when we needed a law that would require drivers to be tested for alcohol if the police thought they might have been drinking. And that was not a popular law, although it made a lot of sense. But I listened to him talk about the 50,000 or so people who were killed on the road, the majority of them in crashes involving drunk drivers. And to me, it seemed obvious that this was a problem that people ought to be working on and getting legislatures to address. I think too few people have recognized the power of state legislatures and the opportunities that not only public health workers, but citizens of all types have to influence those laws. So a lot of the benefit that we have seen has occurred because of state legislatures, the laws that they have passed, the people who have been vocal proponents.
And you have been a source of information and statistics for them to use to back up their legislation.
That's true. I put together a book called the Injury Fact Book that gave details for mortality statistics for about 65 different causes of injury. And that was a great reference book for them and an opportunity for me to focus on some of the problems that were revealed.
What were some of the more surprising problems revealed?
I think in terms of what caught my attention in the Injury Fact Book, one of the graphs showing the death rates in private plane crashes in the Rocky Mountains, because the highest rates had the blackest coloring for those states. And the Rocky Mountains were just a black band from north to south, plus Alaska. And I wondered, why on earth in the Rocky Mountains would we be seeing this? And I called someone at the National Transportation Safety Board and said, do you have any information or do you know anybody who's involved in that? And they referred me to Margaret Lamb, who was a private pilot and an aviation lawyer out in New Mexico. And I called her, got to know her. We went on a exploratory trip in her plane and looked at the sites and got information to publish a paper which pointed out that many of those crashes occurred because the pilots were not responding to information about what was called density altitude, namely the fact that when the weather was hot, the air was thinner, it didn't support planes as easily. And if you were not aware of that, you would put people in your little plane as usual and try to take off and find that you couldn't get over the mountains. That was sort of the beginning of my interest in and activity in research in aviation safety.
So what changed after you showed that the planes were too heavy at certain times?
It's hard to say why the death rates have been going down, but they are certainly not as high now as they were then.
So I understand that one of the places that you learned a lot was when you spent some time researching in the medical examiner's office in Baltimore. And I'm curious if you could tell me about that.
I worked there for many years. That was the first place after I finished my master's degree in public health, the first place where I worked. And that time, which was back in, I guess, the early 1960s, late 1950s, maybe, all of the records were on paper. They were in tan file folders and filed away. But it was possible because of the fact that one could go through the ledgers, and every case that was put in a file was entered into a ledger. And instead, you couldn't press a button on a computer and find out what the files were. But at that time, I had a secretary who could look through the books and pull out all the cases of the type that I wanted to see, like children who had choked to death, food or objects, and then look through all those and see what hit my eye in terms, well, with the choking, for example, the fact that hot dogs and other meat were often involved in childhood choking. A hot dog is really, sounds grim, but the perfect plug for a child's airway. It's round, it's firm, it doesn't break up the way a hamburger does, for example, and it could plug the airway of a child. That was something where it was of great interest, and people did, I think, change the way they fed their children. And if they fed their children hot dogs, that they at least cut them up into smaller pieces. I always wished I could influence the hot dog manufacturers so they would change their product, but I don't know that happened.
So you're the reason why I would cut my children's food up in small pieces.
Yes, I mean, a small piece of hot dog isn't going to choke a child. It might make them happy, though.
So you did all of this work as a woman, and I'm imagining perhaps that it was a little challenging. Can you talk about that?
Well, I can tell you that the first time I went to a meeting of, I think it was the American Trauma Society, I was just a brand new investigator, assistant professor perhaps. I was practically the only woman at this meeting. At the very first coffee break where we broke from sessions, I went over to a small group of men since I seemed to be the only woman around, introduced myself, and the men sort of looked around and the crowd, and some said, "Well, where is your husband?" I said, "Well, he's home in Baltimore at the School of Public Health." And it was kind of a here I am. There were a number of occasions like that where people were surprised that a woman was actually doing the kinds of things that I was.
And you started the Injury Prevention Center at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and that has led to the creation of many other injury prevention centers. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, the students who came from all over the country went home and did the same thing at their schools. So,
how do you feel about how this field has evolved?
Very excited, rewarded. So many of my old students, after 40 years or more, are still in touch with me, and I'm realizing what they're doing. I'm reading their papers, and it's a wonderful experience.
And I think this dovetails perhaps what you're proudest of in your career.
Sure. Yep. I've been very fortunate in having that opportunity. And I was fortunate really in kind of developing my career in the 80s when there was a lot of emphasis on finally having a woman on any important committee. And if they needed a woman who was an expert in highways or somebody who was working hard in that area, there were about two of us. So I had a lot of opportunity I would not have had, actually, had I not been a woman then. A decade earlier, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. So what do you see as your legacy?
I think in a way, the whole field, the fact that people think in terms of how injuries can be prevented, not just in terms of how can we make people be more careful, although that's frequently the knee-jerk reaction. If you ask somebody, how did you break your arm? Oh, I just did something stupid and I tripped over a curbstone. Well, maybe we should be looking at curbstones and not, we all do stupid things from time to time, but getting people to think in terms of how injuries can be prevented, how our environment can be changed, how products can be modified. Some of that reflects my efforts, and so I'm proud of it.
Terrific. What do you see as the future of injury prevention work?
I think injury prevention work will continue to be important, that the people that I think of as sort of my injury prevention grandchildren, if I have trained doctoral students and they have trained others, some of those I think of as being kind of my grandchildren. And they're going out and working on a wide variety of things that I never even thought much about. But I think that we will think and hope that we will continue to see reductions in injury, death rates, and an increase in recognition that they can be prevented.
Sue Baker, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Ceciri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Ceciri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.